In the fight, as it has been described by the president, against a novel coronavirus, formerly the invisible enemy, in his American Rescue Plan, the president has said that the new vaccines made possible under the emergency use authorizations at the FDA and assisted in delivery through the Defense Production Act are our weapon to win this war. And as of this week, over 1/2 of American adults have been vaccinated in an effort to achieve what has been described often in the press as herd immunity, but which actually, in scientists, termed as a herd effect. But I would venture to speculate that just like so many Americans were not familiar with the entrances to their upper respiratory tract, that in August of last year, the CDC had to actually commission a cartoonist to graphically illustrate the proper wearing of a non-medical grade mask, which the NIOSH had determined a decade ago would be battle ineffective in combating the effects of a deadly pandemic, modeling on the most likely reservoir for a pandemic, the avian flu, a validated infectious agent that has to date, since the Spanish flu pandemic, been attributed to as many as 5 pandemic declarations in the past 2 centuries, which probably most of us do not know. But yet and still, half of American adults, legally having attained the age of majority, deemed in the law to have sufficient cognitive function to enter binding agreements and contracts through mutual assent, forming the basis of the rational man standard for negligence in jurisprudence, have volunteered to be administered an experimental vaccine that they know or should know uses unproven modified RNA to attempt to trigger an immune response at the interferon level, another relatively new disease prevention regimen that has yet to find any success, and against a virus, the most abundant biological particles in the world, that nonetheless, despite function of the law of large numbers, before 2019 NCOV, the novel coronavirus, had only produced a total of 220 viruses that were harmful to mankind, and an emerging pathogen from the coronavirus family, the largest family of viruses and the largest in mass, providing the most advantageous evolutionary possibilities for mutant variants, but which were only first discovered in animals, specifically chickens, producing avian bronchitis in 1932, and in humans in 1965, OC229E, a coronavirus very similar in form to the first discovered chicken coronavirus, but only comprising a marginal part of the cocktail mixture of pathogens that cause respiratory tract symptoms and signs in persons afflicted with the common cold, for which, even by 1965, racing to the moon, we had no idea how it was caused. So for the next few moments, let's just have a little academic discussion about viruses and their origins, since this is the pathogen that the vaccine for which over half of all Americans at adult age have volunteered to accept as their defense in what even the nation's only position serving as a state governor has described as a biological war, and as their passport to independence and restored freedoms. It may not surprise you to discover that even in the age of reason, back when folks like Thomas Jefferson were tearing the sections pertaining to miracles from their holy Bibles, even he was greatly disturbed with the erudition and perspicacity of what he may well have described as our pseudoscientists and doctors, who gave him considerable consternation during the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, which was then our nation's capital, lamenting that they appeared to have no methodological and systematic process for identifying causation of disease and developing preventative measures to ward off against the effects of a communicable disease. Recall that in those early ages of medicine, many medical practitioners described as learned men still employed antiquated methods like bloodletting and applying leeches to release the spiritual forces of miasmas that they believed were the root and cause of disease, a laughable proposition today, and which Jefferson thought to be as ridiculous as some of the preachers of his day. And recall from your grammar school science that it was not until a century before, in 1665, that Robert Hooke first discovered cells, or actually their surviving remnants, in cork under a crude microscope. even if today we generally accept those biological particles as the building blocks of all complex life, present in both animals and plants. And appalling as it may be to some academics and atheists, almost a century after the famous Scopes monkey trial, the debate between Darwinian evolution and creation theory, as taught in the Judeo-Christian Bible, still rages on today. But most in schools are taught about the Big Bang, in a time without time, in an expanse of nothingness, giving rise to the creation of the universe, for which there is no proof or evidence in it. And most who do not deny the science accept the thought that, totally by random serendipity, a celestial mass with plenty of water just happened to be placed at the appropriate distance from the sun to create conditions for a primordial soup from which the formation of simple forms of life, probably cells, began to emerge, which through natural selection evolved into more complex beings in the form of plants and animals. Through several stages, were able to emerge from the waters, come up onto land, and even take to the skies, creating the life forms that we witness today. And as for the scientific community, that was beginning to advance into understandings of subatomic particles through pioneers like Madame Curie, searching for X-rays around the end of the 19th century, two scientists dared independently to boldly go where no man had gone before with their microscopes, discovering the very first viruses in plants and animals. So the question arises, and still actually remains unanswered today, from where in this progression of evolution theory did the viruses come? Despite their independent discoveries in the 1890s, believe it or not, most of which scientists know today about viruses has only been determined, or at least guessed, in the past 2 decades, very much like the function and purposes of interferons, the subcellular material contained in living organisms, at least 21 in humans, that provide signal messages to do a variety of yet unknown functions, including the triggering of the immune responses, which forms the guiding rationale for your vaccines, even though yet successfully performed in experiments in combating disease. Our lack of knowledge about viruses not only led to panic during the yellow fever epidemic in the 1790s, much to the dismay of Thomas Jefferson, but also to over 22,000 deaths during the construction of the Panama Canal at the beginning of the 20th century, the American century, where both indigenous peoples in the jungles of Panama appeared to concur with scientists and engineers regarding the cause of the coordinated infections of lethal yellow fever and incapacitating malaria, attributing the disease condition to the presence of bad air, hence malaria, and adopting a preventative strategy for mitigation and flattening the curve through the donning of useless facial coverings, not quite waiting for herd immunity. And but not for the determined efforts of 2 Army engineers, Colonel Gorgas and Major Ross, who did not even know about viruses at the time, but had encountered a similar field problem in Havana, and through the powers of simple observation, empirical observation, were able to develop a stratagem to successfully block the mosquitoes that appeared to be the immediate cause. An acceptable loss of lives had continued because the scientists were convinced that their time-tested methods were correct. A certain hubris amongst the scientists. Similarly, not long after, during the Spanish flu pandemic, the fatalities continued to rise for 2 years, the general duration of all pandemics. Before the pandemic, pathogens simply ran out of fuel and moved to an endemic through its own natural cause, giving rise to questions in terms of why anyone would rush for a year to develop a vaccine that within just a year would be not needed because the pathogen would have run its course. While the scientists developed and promoted a vaccine to prevent what was described as Pfeiffer bacteria, which he believed was the cause of the avian flu infection, an H1N1 virus, which led to what is estimated to be between 50 and 100 million fatalities worldwide, a condition that infected about a quarter of the American population and was responsible for killing almost as many soldiers during World War I as battlefield losses. H1N1, a validated infectious disease that has been attributed to at least 5 pandemics. But research for a possible emerging pathogen coming from the coronavirus family that was practically unknown as a cause for any independent condition until between 2003 and 2005, when suddenly 5 bat coronaviruses all by themselves appeared to have zoonotically evolved with origins in China, beginning with SARS in Hong Kong. A 35% case fatality pathogen that found primarily all outbreaks in hospital settings with no wider community spread. So the question arises, from where did these invisible enemies that appear all too often to baffle the scientists in the most deadly pandemics and epidemics actually come, so as to give rise to a novel coronavirus presently that has changed even what was formerly familiar as the American way of life, and for which over half of adult Americans of majority age and fully responsible for their choices, and which is attributable to the deaths of over 500,000 Americans, over 10,500 in the Commonwealth of Virginia, with the elderly in nursing homes, a known high fatality risk from the very beginning, accounting for over 60% of the dead, which no one can deny. This may sound like the beginning of a great conspiracy theory, but it is actually not. And in April 2020, while Virginians were beginning to lock down, receive their news from cable news networks, who began for the first time in history to earn more revenue from transfer fees from local cable companies as more people entered subscription agreements, and watching Netflix while schools and libraries were closed, took this opportunity for a hiatus to examine this very question that had appeared to baffle scientists for years. From where did viruses arise? Even though some of those in faith abandoned reading their Bibles, these scientists took to the science to take a look at this very intriguing question in their faith of science, the origin and cause of viruses. And reviewing various articles and research from past, they were able to determine that scientists who have the opportunity to consider this vexing question have proposed at least 3 hypotheses. First is an independent descent from the primordial soup as pre-cellular genetic elements, finding these single strands of RNA simply emerging on their own. A theory that runs into problems because we know that all viruses require a human or living host to replicate, presenting a dead end. Second, that they arose through reductive evolution from cellular ancestors, or simply cellular-based species that made the wrong choices in natural selection, spinning themselves into extinction. But then again, running into the dead end of requiring a living host to replicate. And third, the most promising theory is that they arose through escape of genes from a cellular host, achieving thereby a partial replicative autonomy for becoming parasitic genetic elements. Scientists point out that all 3 of these theories, educated guesses that are founded upon some validating empirical evidentiary basis and principles, do not explain what they describe as the provenance of the 2 key functional modules that are responsible, respectively, for virus genome replication, as we have explained before, and virion or subvirus particles morphogenesis. But coronaviruses, both the largest family of viruses and the largest in sheer mass, may provide some clues as to the origins of this ever-elusive and larger-than-God particle, at least in the current public health crisis we call a pandemic. From what science has been able to determine is that at some point in their evolution, chickens developed a disease condition of avian bronchitis, which by 1932, medical researchers using established virology and epidemiology tools like Coach's postulates abandoned in the pandemic, that had been developed in the 1870s by Robert Koch, who was attempting to explain the mysteries of anthrax bacteria spores, 8,000 to 50,000 of which are required to cause a disease condition amongst humans, but a communicable disease amongst animals was caused by the very first coronavirus that had been discovered. Scientists know that coronaviruses are so large in sheer mass that they have a tendency to be unstable and simply fall apart under the weight of their own mass, which through centuries and millennia of evolution and natural selection required them to develop a gain of function to simply avoid the fate of extinction, falling apart of their own accord. And scientists have determined through a scientific method that they had naturally selected a safe zone along the genome strand for any and all mutations to occur, generally at the center, providing for a stabilization zone at the center, holding the genome together, and permitting variation on the ends, which is probably why almost all coronaviruses find genomic sequencing up to 80 to 90% similar, at least the ones that we have examined, because mutation is only permissible in that torusal area, holding the dangling ends attached like subcellular form of crazy. As the largest in mass of all viruses, it is reasonably expected that if coronaviruses arose as genetic materials in cellular organisms that somehow, at some point in time, managed to break away, these very large and complex coronaviruses more likely than not found their origins in more complex living organisms. So it is not exactly surprising that scientists have discovered coronaviruses in both mammals and avian species so far, which are pretty complex living organisms. And under what is referred as a closed system analysis, it is not exactly far-fetched to hypothesize that even though the very first coronavirus was discovered in chickens, attributed as the cause of avian bronchitis, that chicken coronaviruses actually, rather than zoonotically evolving to human coronaviruses, actually arose as an avian infection through continued interaction with humans in that closed system, a virtual reverse zoonotic evolution that would have found them already having those essential elements to become a human cause of disease in terms of that interaction with the ACE2 enzyme and the spike protein. And support for this theory is found in the fact that the first human coronavirus not only appeared to be similar to chicken coronaviruses, but lacked any potential to be an independent cause for any known human disease condition, making up only a fractional part of the common cold. But if, say, a farmer in close interaction with his farm animals happened to have visited the chicken coop while signs of infection, while afflicted with a common cold, it is not unlikely that he may have presented those asymptomatic signs of infection while coughing and sneezing while tending to his farm animal, all around the barn, depositing sufficient specimens of coronavirus to present a risk of droplet or even fomite or surface contamination infection for the chickens to become infected with his virus. Chickens that were smaller, less complex animal forms that have, even in experiments with COVID-19, have found to require a far less infectious dose, enabling us to experiment with COVID-19 and Syrian hamsters and some birds, and thereby passing on what was for humans a rather innocuous and marginal co-infecting agent in the cocktail mixture of the common cold, a causative element for a full-blown symptomatic disease in chickens. I believe it's one of the most ghostly manifestations that I have ever seen. Whether it is real or simply conjecture, one of those things that people seeking to find some mystery to fool themselves into believing. But
with some other perfectly rational cause is a question that only you can answer with your capacity for reason. Impossible? So was Xeroxing and holography just a few years ago. In fact, so were videotape replays like the one you're watching right now. People have been claiming an existence of God for thousands of years, and maybe one day we will finally know the answers as to how and why and what. What a tremendous gain that would be for science, but what a tragic loss for storytelling. No one knows the day nor the hour when all mysteries shall be revealed, but we'll be watching and we'll be waiting in earnest, incessant, and fervent prayer for the advancement of the kingdom of God. Be sure to join us next time as events evolve with science and faith in a pandemic election that some have claimed is the presidential election of their lifetime.
This is a no-brainer, folks. It doesn't get any easier than this. My name is Major Mike Webb. By God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb. End of the day, I really don't give a damn. It's not my department. Honest. And y'all come back now. Here. Honest.